G'day friends, it's Andrew Goodall here from Nature's Image Photography on a very wet and windy afternoon, and I've got a video today which is not just for the Panasonic users who follow me, but for anyone who's learning photography. Now I'm going to walk slowly towards the camera, and as I do I want you to consider the fact that from where I've started right up to where I finish, if everything goes according to plan, I'm going to be in focus the entire time. Now that might have you wondering, what focus method am I using? Am I using AFC to track a moving subject? Am I using a human detect autofocus area mode in order to make sure the camera stays locked onto me? Well, it might surprise you to know that the camera is actually set to manual focus, and it's been focused on these green mossy bricks here the entire time. The fact that I've been in focus from way back there to here has nothing to do with the autofocus and everything to do with depth of field. Now, depth of field, you might immediately start thinking, okay, well if this video is about depth of field, I wonder what aperture he'd be using to film this little video clip. Well, my answer to that is very simple. Don't know, don't care. Now, aperture is only one small part of the depth of field puzzle. Unfortunately, it's the one thing most people learn, and often the only thing people learn about depth of field, and there's a whole lot more to depth of field than that. So in this video I want to give you a more well-rounded look at how depth of field works. Now, the one thing I won't be doing in this video is explaining what depth of field actually is right from first principles. I've already done that in a video which is in my photography school playlist. So if you are an absolute beginner who is just getting started and doesn't even know what depth of field is, let alone how to control it, you can find that link in the details below. So this video isn't really about explaining it right from first principles. It's more about filling in the gaps in what you might already know and taking a more well-rounded look at depth of field, because there's a lot more to depth of field than just the aperture.
So why do another video about depth of field? Well, I recently had a fairly wide-ranging Zoom conversation with a customer from Canada. Along the way he asked me if most of my wildlife photos were taken with a wide aperture. And of course the answer was yes. A wide aperture allows me to shoot handheld with a fast shutter speed and gives a nice shallow depth of field that works for many wildlife photos. Next, he said, and I suppose most of your landscapes are taken at around f/16. When I asked him why, he said surely I must be using a small aperture to get such a strong depth of field in my landscapes. So he was surprised when I told him that no, I shoot most of my landscapes with a fairly wide aperture, often as wide as it can go. And that reminds me of a Facebook conversation I once had about this photo, where people could understand why I used a wide aperture to allow for a fast shutter speed to freeze the action of the water, but they were puzzled by the huge depth of field in the picture, which flies in the face of everything they were taught about the relationship between aperture and depth of field. There are two basic facts we're told when we first start learning about camera settings. Shutter speed affects sharpness, and aperture affects depth of field. And for many people, that's all they are ever really taught about depth of field. It's not wrong, it's just one piece of a bigger story, because aperture isn't the only factor that determines depth of field. It's not even the most important factor. In fact, in some respects, it might even be the least important. But good luck finding a teacher who'll ever tell you that. So, after that very long introduction, in this video I want to explain the three factors that affect depth of field, and then I'll try to explain where aperture fits in the depth of field puzzle. But before we start, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for lots more from my world of photography. And if you really learned something from this video and you want to support me, well, I do like a nice coffee, and you can buy me one using the link in the information below. Okay, so we're going to look at three factors, and the first two have nothing to do with aperture. Factor number 1, distance from the subject. The closer you get to the subject, the less depth of field you're going to have. And of course the flip side of that is, the further you get from the subject, the more depth of field you're going to have. So simply by walking closer to your subject, the depth of field is reduced. When you get further away, it increases. And by the way, I'm using portraits here because I know for a fact both sets of photos were taken using the same lens and the same aperture, so the difference in depth of field here is purely down to distance from the subject. But of course this distance thing applies to any kind of photography. It's part of the reason why it's so easy to keep landscape photos sharp. Not the whole reason, but part of it. With many of our landscape photos, all the main features are a fair distance from the camera, and therefore a stronger depth of field is inevitable. It's also the reason why macro photography can be so challenging. If getting closer means less depth of field, then getting this close can make it extremely difficult to keep very much of the subject in focus. Now on to factor number 2, the size of the lens. And when I say size, I don't mean physical size, I mean focal length. Once again, the correlation is very simple. The bigger the lens you use, the less depth of field you have. So a photo taken with a telephoto lens is going to have a relatively small depth of field, no matter what aperture you use. And again, there's the flip side. The smaller the lens, the greater the depth of field. This time round, I'm sharing 3 photos from my Tanzania tour. I couldn't get out of the vehicle on this game drive, so all the photos were taken from the same distance. The difference is in how far I zoomed for each shot, and as you can see, the more my focal length increased, the shallower the depth of field became. And finally this one from a different day, a shot taken with a wide-angle lens, showing that very strong sharpness from the nearest elephant all the way to the horizon. And that's the very strong depth of field you naturally expect from a wide-angle lens. So now we've seen 2 impacts on depth of field, and neither of them have anything to do with the aperture. But they do have something in common, and that's how close the subject appears to be from the camera. So whether you physically get closer to the subject, or whether you zoom in with a bigger lens, either way the depth of field will be reduced. And again the flip side, if the subject appears further away, the depth of field will increase, and that can be either because you're physically further away, or because you zoomed back with a wider angle lens. Now as I scroll through some examples, have a think about how we tend to approach most of our wildlife photography. Not all, but most. We tend to use telephoto lenses, and we usually try to get as close as possible to the subject. It's an approach we often use for portrait photography as well, and the natural consequence of this approach is that it creates a shallow depth of field, and that perfectly suits photos like this, where you want the attention to be on the subject and not so much on the background. And now have a think about what we commonly see in landscape photography. They're usually done with wider angle lenses to capture a lot more of the scenery, and most of the features are typically further away from the camera. Now that's an approach that inevitably leads to a strong depth of field, which is exactly what you want from photos like these. So now we can see that depth of field is very much a consequence of focal length and distance from the subject, and subjects that we usually shoot at close range with a telephoto lens tend to be the subjects that look good with a shallow depth of field. Subjects that we shoot from further away with a wide-angle lens are usually the subjects that benefit from more depth of field. So most of the time you don't need to overthink it. These 2 factors alone mean we often end up getting the look we want without even trying. Now let me address the specific point that my friend from Canada raised that I mentioned at the start of the video. This photo was taken on the Lumix S1 with a 16mm lens, which is very wide for a full-frame camera. The aperture is wide open at f4, and yet the depth of field is pretty much 100%. From the nearest rock all the way to the horizon, everything is sharp. Our theory tells us that depth of field increases when we make the aperture smaller. But if my depth of field is 100% with the aperture wide open, what do I really have to gain from a smaller aperture? My depth of field wouldn't increase, but I would have to choose a slower shutter speed, which is no good for freezing the action, or I would have to put the ISO up, which can compromise image quality. Okay, to satisfy the more experienced photographers watching this video, here's a quick disclaimer before we move on. I know that it's the general wisdom that most lenses are sharper if you close the aperture down a stop or 2. When you read reviews of most lenses, they usually conclude that the lens is sharpest at around f8. For that reason, a lot of people prefer to shoot at around f8, and I will too sometimes, as long as it doesn't cost me too much in terms of shutter speed or ISO. So in this discussion, I'm not saying you should shoot with the aperture wide open, I'm only saying that in a lot of situations, it won't make any difference to the depth of field. Okay, so when exactly does aperture play a real role in depth of field? Well, in situations where your depth of field is likely to be shallow from the start. And as we've seen, that's when you are closer to the subject and using a bigger lens. That combination naturally creates a shallow depth of field, so with the aperture wide open you might sometimes find that your depth of field is a bit too shallow. When it comes to wildlife, if I'm shooting just one subject, I have no problem with shooting with the aperture wide open. But if I have 2 subjects, I'll often close it down a few stops to make sure I can keep them both sharp, especially when the subjects appear at different distances from the camera. but I'm careful to make sure I don't do it at the expense of shutter speed. To put it simply, I would rather have a sharp photo that lacks a little in depth of field than have a blurry photo because my shutter speed was too slow. I mentioned earlier macro is one type of photography where depth of field can often be too shallow, simply because you're shooting from so close to the subject. So it's another area where a smaller aperture can come to the rescue. Here, going from f4 to f9 was enough to sharpen up a problematic shot. This is also one of the reasons why so many macro photographers use flash. If you can flood the subject with loads of extra light, it becomes much easier to sharpen up the photo with a smaller aperture. And now I guess it's time to sum this thing up. A smaller aperture will increase your depth of field, but really only in those situations where it was shallow to begin with. So for subjects like this it can make a big difference. But for subjects like this it makes little or no difference, but it will cause you to slow down your shutter speed or increase your ISO for no good reason. As I said in my opening comments, one of the first things we learn about photography is that aperture affects depth of field. It's just important to remember that's only one part of a three-part story, and unfortunately a lot of teachers leave you to figure out the other two parts for yourself. So yes, a smaller aperture will increase your depth of field, but don't overthink it, because a lot of the work will be done for you anyway, just by getting further away from the subject, and even more so by getting further away from the subject with a wider angle lens. So, thanks to my friend from Canada for asking the question that sparked this topic. For you, and I guess many others out there, I hope this video helps make the depth of field puzzle just a little easier to understand. For now, I'm Andrew Goodall, this is Nature's Image Photography. Thanks for watching.